and I'm sure you know this, but you need to remember to divide your time equally. It's very easy to get carried away with the first question, particularly the Shakespeare question if you feel confident with that one, and squeeze your time for the sign of 4, but you need to weight them equally. And then remember though, the same rules apply actually for both of those essays. In both instances you're given an extract and you've got to relate that to the whole text. So on your PowerPoint slide you can see there's a little picture of somebody jumping off, and that's as a reminder that really what you should be doing is using the extract and the quotations that you pull out of the extract as jumping off points to get you to other key areas of the text. So whatever they give you, you need to be thinking, what does this remind me of? What links can I make to other parts of the text? That's your kind of starting point. So because you're aiming for the very top grades, I thought what was important was to establish what do we actually mean by an essay? What are we looking for at A level and then also at degree level after you finish your GCSEs? Because some of you I think will be heading in that direction, and it would be nice if you could put in the same kind of skills now that you might be using later. So the first thing is a good essay has a clear aim, and what I mean by that is you have something in mind that you want to prove, basically, a theory, if you like, about the text. And that should be outlined in your introduction. So the introduction to a good essay should basically state your aims. It's not too different really from things that you do in science when you say what you're trying to find out. You're doing something similar in an essay. And we call that a thesis, basically, a central argument, the line of argument that you're going to follow. Okay? You're going to elaborate on that in the main body of your essay. So from that introduction onwards, you're going to be unpacking that and looking for evidence that supports your argument or thesis statement. Okay? And then you're going to return to that in your conclusion. So your conclusion is going to kind of summarise how you have proved, essentially, that thesis, how your research on the text in that instance has shown that you were correct in making that statement at the beginning. So, for example, can you make a thesis statement, like a single sentence, that sums up what you think Shakespeare is trying to achieve, depending on what the question is? That's really the basis of it. So if you have a look at the example on there, if your question, for example, was how does Shakespeare present women in this extract and in the play as a whole, you need to have a thesis statement, like your perspective on how you think Shakespeare presents women as your starting point, and everything else comes from that. So for example, you might say Shakespeare presents women as victims of men's folly. You know, Juliet ends up dead because of the mistakes that Romeo makes and because of the things that her cousin does and her father does and everything else. Or you might say, actually, Shakespeare's presenting women as unsung heroes because Juliet's death at the end kind of subverts the idea of the maiden in distress, doesn't it? Because she's the one who stabs herself. Romeo takes the easier route of drinking poison. So you could look at that as your argument. You might also say, well, actually, no, the women in the play are naive, like Juliet is, and easily manipulated. But you've got to have a clear perspective, and that's kind of what separates, I think, the grade 5 and 6 essays from year 7 and upwards essays, because they've got a clear argument, they've got something that they want to say, and they're proving it, basically. Okay, so let's think about Romeo and Juliet specifically now. The starting point, I think, should always be the context, because this is a play that isn't conceived in a vacuum. It's been created, and the things that have impacted upon it have been contextual, haven't they? Things about the author's or the writer's life, things about the times in which he lived, influences upon him from other people, and all of those should be things that you consider, particularly if they're relevant to your thesis statement. So let's think of it as a sort of who, what, where, why, and break it down a little bit. So first of all, Shakespeare is the who, isn't he? He's the writer. So what do we know about him? Truthfully, not a great deal. But we do know that he got married very young. When he was about 17, he got a woman pregnant. She was much older than him. She was in her early 20s, and he had to marry her because that was the convention. She was of the sort of family who wouldn't have allowed him to do that and not marry her. And so he was trapped, essentially, into a marriage very, very young. And we know that later he left the marital home. They did have children, but he left and went off to London to pursue a career as an actor, where he had lots of affairs with both men and women. So presumably it wasn't a hugely happy marriage, and possibly he regretted it a little. So when we start to think about a play about young lovers who rush in very quickly, perhaps we can start to see, oh, perhaps this is a reflection of his own views. Consider also the fact that this is a 16th century text, very late 16th century, so this is a time when the world that he lived in was very different culturally from the one that we live in. And one of the principal differences, I think, is that we live in still, I think, a kind of post-Victorian world, in that our culture, particularly around humour, we think of as being quite prudish. I think British people generally are considered to be fairly prudish compared to other cultures. That wasn't the case for Shakespeare. So if you're familiar with the term bawdy, which is just B-A-W-D-Y, that was the word that was used to describe the humour at that time, which basically meant sexual. So a bawdy house was a brothel, a bawd was a madam, a woman who ran a brothel, and so bawdy humour, bawdy jokes was anything sexual, basically. And that was the most popular form of humour at that time, and certainly in the theatre as well. So that starts to shed light for us, doesn't it, on the opening scene, the kind of all the puns and jokes about maidens and maidenheads. So consider that.
Do one of you boys want to come and sit here? Would that be a
Yeah,
good idea?
I think we've had 2 interruptions now. Can you just...
I think that's 3 times now, isn't it?
Okay. The next thing to consider is the what. So what is Romeo and Juliet? Well, it's a tragedy, and that's really important because as a genre, a tragedy has really fixed and specific features. So, for example, it has an inevitability about it, and that idea of tragedy being inevitable, the death of the tragic hero being inevitable, was outlined thousands of years ago by Aristotle. And Shakespeare draws on that ancient Greek tradition in his own writing. So the Shakespearean tragedy follows the same kind of pattern Aristotle laid out in his book about drama called Poetics. And in those days, literature only existed in the form of poetry or drama. There was no such thing as novels in those days. And that was true also of Shakespeare's day. There were no novels then either. There was just poetry and drama. And within drama, Aristotle said there are 2 types of play, there are 2 types of drama. There's comedy and there's tragedy. And they both should follow set rules and they should both do specific things for their audience. And a tragedy is really about fate. It's about the inevitability of the tragic hero's demise. He cannot escape his fate because he is the tragic hero. So there is some fatal flaw within him, which is in Greek his hamartia, and that feature, that flaw within his character will always lead to his death, because that's how a tragedy always ends, with the death of the tragic hero. A comedy, on the other hand, always ends with a wedding. If you've seen some of the comedy plays, you might remember that or have noticed that. So Shakespeare's working within a framework that's already established. The Shakespearean tragedy fits Aristotle's model, and it's what people had come to expect. So it's why, for example, the prologue gives away so much of the plot, because it's no surprise to people that the 2 are going to end up dead, because they've seen the black flag flying above Shakespeare's globe. They know that they're going to see a tragedy, so they know what to expect. But Shakespeare is allowing us to see how that kind of inevitability of the tragic hero actually relates to everybody's lives, because what he shows, I suppose, is the fallibility of human beings, that people make mistakes all the time that often lead to their undoing. And it ties in as well, of course, to the idea of fate being written in the stars, and that's what people believed in the 16th century. They thought that you could make a map of where the stars were in the sky the day you were born, and that if you could read that correctly, that would predict accurately where you were going to end up, basically. And Shakespeare probably believed that himself. Certainly lots of his audience believed that, and we see that reflected in the play. So the frequent references to stars ties directly to the idea of fate, which in turn links to that context of tragedy. So we see that the context kind of informs every element of the play, really. I've talked about Elizabethan London a little bit, about the bawdy culture. This is the kind of Renaissance period, so there's a resurgence of classical ideas. And by classical, I mean things from ancient Greece and ancient Rome. And one of those things, like we've talked about, was this tragic form of drama, but there was also Renaissance influences from the classical world on poetry. So Petrarch, for example, who popularised the sonnet in Italy, which Shakespeare was then inspired by, was drawing on classical influences. So the fact that it takes place within the Renaissance, this kind of resurgence of an interest in the ancient world and in creating art, is important as well. Finally, his message, and that's probably the most important thing in terms of the context, I think. I think what Shakespeare wants to say, what you think he's saying to his audience, is the most important thing that you need to consider. And it's completely ambiguous, really. My personal view is that it's a mockery of young love almost. It's a kind of a reminder to people who are older of how foolish they may have been when they were younger. I don't think Romeo and Juliet's love is supposed to be the way it's often popularised, as in a sort of glorious example of love in its purest form. I think it's supposed to be stupidity in its purest form, and Romeo's fatal flaw, arguably, is falling in love so easily. Juliet's fatal flaw is trusting him, I think, trusting men more generally, perhaps. And all of the older characters seem to know better. So Friar Lawrence knows better, the nurse knows better, they see it much more pragmatically. Probably like Shakespeare himself looked back at his young self. Now, he wrote this play when he was still a fairly young man, but nevertheless he was married with children by this time. The plays that he wrote later, like Macbeth, that you might have studied when you were, I don't know.
I don't think they would have done that actually.
Well,
yeah, maybe, yeah. But some odd.
so that play is, I think, a much more, I think the ideas in the play actually have changed and matured since Romeo and Juliet. I think you can see a kind of progression in Shakespeare's kind of line of thought and the things that he's interested in and the things that he wants to say. But nevertheless, I think Romeo and Juliet is a kind of, it gives voice to his point of view, basically, on love. However, you might say, and you could reasonably argue this, that actually it's a celebration of love, that it's about the glory of sacrifice and the honour that it is to be found in sacrificing oneself for love. Like at the end, Romeo's father says he's going to raise a statue of Juliet in purest gold, like she's going to be an icon of love, basically. And you might, as a romantic, say, well, actually, that's the point. This is a celebration of young love and its power to transform, because it's their deaths, of course, that brings the two families together. So it really depends on your perspective, but you need to have an idea, you need to have a perspective on what you think Shakespeare was trying to say. So, what are the main themes of the play? Because the next thing, I think, once you've considered context, the next thing to consider is the themes, because you should be kind of working outwards to get further in and closer to the play. If you start from inside the play, like here are the quotations from the play, you're limiting the grade that you can get, I think. And examiners have said in the past things like, the best students get outside of the text. So my best advice is to start from the outside, start with the context and work your way in. So the next rung, if you like, as we go inwards, is the themes, are the themes, the things that we see kind of as threads running through the play. And the kind of words as well that are likely to be in the question, because there'll always be a key word in the question. Now it could be, if it's a character question, that may not be the case, it might just be how does Shakespeare present Mercutio in this scene and in the rest of the play. But if it's not, it's going to be a theme. So fate, first of all. I've already mentioned this, but fate obviously relates to tragedy, the idea of the inevitable death and demise of the tragic hero. There's frequent allusions to it, which I'll go into in a moment when we look at the key moments. But it seems to be something that Shakespeare regards as inescapable. So a person like Romeo cannot escape his fate. Whatever choice he takes and whatever thing he does, it's always the wrong thing at the wrong time, or the wrong thing at the right time for fate, I suppose. Masculinity is another key theme. Now this, I think, is really interesting, again in terms of the context. Remember, Shakespeare's a fairly young man when he wrote this. He's, gadding about London as a young actor, having affairs all over the place and having the time of his life, getting into scrapes and generally kind of living his best life. And I think the reflection of the young men in this play is a kind of nod to that. Like, he understands better than, certainly me, how young men behave with each other, like what those relationships are like and what they're founded on. So all of the kind of joshing and banter between the characters in the opening scene, for example, the servants of the Capulets when they're about to start the first brawl, that's, I think, like a really accurate depiction of that kind of those relationships between young men, drawn probably from his direct experience, because what do we know about actors in the 16th century and people who were on the stage? They were all men. There weren't any women. So every time he went on tour with his group of players, it was, 30 young men, some of whom would have been in their early teens because they had to play the women, so they needed them to look and sound girlish. Some of them would have been older men, but the way that they behave with each other, I think, has influenced the way he's written those characters. So that's something to consider, because he shows us, doesn't he, different sides of masculinity. He shows us, arguably, good men. Benvolio is objectively a good character. His name is from the Italian bene, isn't it? Good. Like, his whole character is about being good, being sensible, doing the right thing, making the right decisions. So he, I think, is a sort of ideal young man. I think Shakespeare probably wishes he'd been more of a Benvolio when he was young, because Benvolio's perspective on love as well is sensible. You know, when Romeo's breaking his heart over Rosaline, he says, you know, give liberty unto thine eyes, examine other beauties. Like, there's plenty of fish in the sea, basically. He doesn't get tied down to one person when he's too young, and perhaps therefore he's a reflection of Shakespeare's own kind of anxieties about himself. Tybalt, on the other hand, everybody knows a Tybalt. Everybody's seen a Tybalt getting into a fight at school or in a bar or somewhere else. Everybody knows that there are those young men for whom their reputation and the way other people perceive them is the most important thing in the world, and not losing face is the most important thing in the world, and really they don't care about anything else. So again, Shakespeare will have met Tybalts. Everybody's met them. And Mercutio, like again, Mercutio is a standard kind of trope. He's the class clown, isn't he? He's the clever boy who likes to be heard, likes to entertain people, likes to laugh, not so interested in women, probably, I think, a gay character who, it's never said, but I think he's probably in love with Romeo. I think that his anger at Romeo's kind of distance from him is a suggestion of that. And again, Shakespeare was an actor. He knew plenty of guys like Mercutio. You know, he wrote that part probably for a certain person who he wanted to play him, because he's a type, isn't he? All of these characters kind of fall into types. Love, obviously, is another major theme, and you can say all sorts of things about that. It could come up in the question, it might well. There are different types of love, though. It's worth considering that, because if you want to go kind of above the average student and say something that not everybody's going to say, well then, what about the love between the men? That's important. What about Tybalt's love of his family honour? What about Capulet's love of his daughter that's kind of in tension with his desire to make an allegiance with the cousin of the prince and marry her off to Paris? What about Juliet's love for the nurse over her own mother, because that's a reflection of those kind of relationships at that time where young women like her were raised really by their nurse and not by their mothers. So there's different ways of looking at love. It doesn't just have to be Romeo and Juliet are in love with each other. There's more to say, I think. Death is another theme, obviously, and it's a constant kind of scythe hanging over the stage, isn't it? Because we know from the prologue that they're both going to die. We know that their death is going to be as a result of things that we're going to see. So it's there all the time. And then it comes up throughout the play as well, which is, again, probably a reflection of what the audience wanted. You know, they like to go to the theatre and see some pig blood splashed around and have a good time. These are people who on a Friday might go to see the hangings at Tyburn, you know, and people having their throats cut or whatever else. So they want to see something that looks authentic when they go to the theatre. And so we've got the death of Mercutio first, and then the death of Tybalt, and we've got all the brawling and fighting as well. Parenthood as a final theme. This, to my knowledge, has never come up as a question explicitly, but it could, because there's a lot in there actually about parents and their children, especially Juliet's parents, but Romeo's parents as well. Don't forget, they appear at the beginning of the play, desperately concerned about their son, with Lady Montague, you know, saying, you know, where is Romeo? Right, glad I am he's not at this fray. Like, he's not involved in the fighting, but there's something worse for her that's wrong with him. Because she says she's glad he wasn't there, but it's almost like, why wasn't he there? Why isn't he like the other young men? And then his father reveals, well, he shuts himself up in his room. He goes moping around in the grove of sycamores in the early hours. He doesn't want to see anybody. He doesn't want to talk. What's wrong with him? His father doesn't understand him. And that's an age-old kind of issue and problem, isn't it, that Shakespeare's reflecting. Possibly he had that kind of relationship with his own father when he was having this affair with, you know, Anne Hathaway, or Anne Shakespeare as she became. Anyway, right, so key moments. This is the next rung in. So we're basically now, we've considered the context, we've considered all the major themes, we're now kind of in the play. What are the major things that we need to consider? So I've said to consider them as moments rather than just quotes, because actually the quotations only get you so far. You've got to think about where they take place, what's happening around them, and where it's going, and where those moments take us. So the ones that I've listed as being particularly important, the prologue first of all, because it establishes so much for us, doesn't it? The third civil brawl, so that's the fight at the beginning basically, and we learn that it's the third one because that's what the prince tells them. Thrice you have disturbed the quiet of our streets. So we know this is the third of a few, and that's kind of the point. We arrive like right in the action, don't we? And that establishes for us the conflict, which is another major theme, isn't it, between the two families. Now, the next one I've written is Romeo's gut feeling, and this is just before he goes off to the Capulets' ball, and he says,
I guess the dream.
Yeah, that's how he begins, and then Mercutio is trying to sort of josh him along, and Benvolio is encouraging him to go. And he says, "I fear some consequence yet hanging in the stars." And that quote, I love that quotation because it's he fears something, he feels something in his gut. There's going to be some consequence, but he doesn't yet know what it is. Of course, we know what it is. And it's yet hanging in the stars. And that word hanging is so key because it hasn't happened yet. He's got the chance to turn his back and say, "I've got a bad feeling, I'm not going to go to this party." But instead, he says, "Let he who hath the steerage of my course direct my sail." And off he goes. Meaning, whoever's controlling me and where I go. And Shakespeare uses the image of a ship or a bark or a boat frequently to describe the way people are moved through life by tides and invisible forces. Direct my sail, like, show me where to go, fate, and I'll follow. And so he does, he goes willingly. And he walks ultimately to his death, doesn't he? Because he goes there, not only does he meet Juliet, which sets things in motion, but he also upsets Tybalt, which is what leads Tybalt to challenge him, which is what leads to the brawl that kills Mercutio, which is what leads Romeo to murder Tybalt, which is what makes him have to leave Verona, which is why Juliet does what she does, which is why he ends up killing himself. So that decision, everything hangs on that moment, and that word hanging is really key. Then we've got the first meeting, which I've just said that's important because it's the first time that we see Tybalt, and we realise no, it's not, sorry, we've met him earlier, haven't we? Peace, I hate the word. We saw him in the brawl, but now we see him again within his family setting, and he's restrained by his uncle. So he's not going to attack Romeo at the party because his uncle won't let him, but clearly something's simmering, and he tells us that this meeting, which now seems sweet, will convert to bitterest gall. Gall being like poison, like Tybalt's carrying something around with him that's going to have an outcome. And it's ironic as well, isn't it? Gall, poison, Romeo ends up poisoning himself at the end, perhaps. Then the warning of Friar Lawrence. I think this is really key because I think Friar Lawrence is like the wise old owl that Shakespeare wishes he'd had to advise him. Maybe he did have one and he ignored them just like Romeo does, but Friar Lawrence frequently reminds him to not rush, and he says things to him like, wisely and slow they stumble that run fast. You know, like, slow yourself down because this is going to go wrong, and of course it does. And he also tells him, love moderately, long love doth so. Like, don't love somebody too hard and too much because that'll make it go wrong. You know, the sweetest honey is loathsome in its own deliciousness. Like, something that seems great for a little while, if you eat too much of it, will make you sick. And that's what Romeo and Juliet are going to do, is what Friar Lawrence is implying. And of course, he's right, isn't he? He foreshadows and predicts lots of what comes next. I'm just going to check where I am with time. All right, I've got a minute or so left. Mercutio's Marlowe moment I've written on that PowerPoint, and Romeo as Fortune's fool. So Christopher Marlowe, again, we're sort of zooming back out to context. Christopher Marlowe is a playwright and a contemporary of Shakespeare, somebody who Shakespeare knew. I wouldn't go so far as to say that they were friends. Certainly they were...
like healthy rivals.
Yes, yeah, rivals is a good way of putting it. And Shakespeare, I think, probably regarded Marlowe as a bit of a Mercutio. I think in many ways Mercutio represents Christopher Marlowe, who had a fiery temper, who liked to have a fight, who liked to show off, liked to play with words and impress people with this sort of speed of his wit, which is exactly what Mercutio does and what Mercutio values. Now Mercutio, that word, the word mercurial, from Mercury, means something that's changeable, or someone who's changeable. So Mercutio as a name suggests a character who's very changeable, whose temperature can rise really suddenly. And of course that's exactly what he does. He loses his temper, he gets into that brawl, and Romeo, in retribution for that and to take revenge for that, kills Tybalt, and as soon as he's done it, he knows what he's done, and he says, "Oh, I am Fortune's fool." And fortune is fate. It's just another word for fate, you know, like having your fortune told, finding out your future. And he gives it a capital F and personifies it, like as if fate or fortune is this person watching over his life. And it is, it's the person who directed his sail, isn't it? And so he's basically saying, you know, I've done exactly the wrong thing. This is what I was being set up for, and I've walked right into it. And then later, of course, so ironic, because at the end of the play, when he finds, or near the end of the play, when he finds out that Juliet's dead, and we know she isn't, dramatic irony, but he thinks she is, he says, "Well, I defy you, stars." So again, he's talking to fate. The stars are the same as fortune, are the same as fate. He's saying, I defy you, like I'm going to go against what you want, and I'm going to take my own life. Well, we know he's not going against anything. That's exactly what fate wants him to do. Like, that was the plan all along, basically. He just doesn't know it. So he is a fool, and that line where he says, I'm fortune's fool, is the truest line in the play, probably. And Friar Lawrence, when he tells him, thou art wedded to calamity, again, really speaking truth about Romeo, like he's got disaster attached to him from the moment he was born, and we know that because the prologue told us, from forth the fatal loins. So when he was born to die, basically. Now the nurse's summation, I've put the full quotation on there because I think it's a good one. There's no trust, no faith, no honesty in men, all perjured, all forsworn, all naught, all dissemblers. Basically means, the first bit's quite obvious, but the second bit, to be perjured is to lie. All forsworn means to lie, to break a vow. All naught just means all nothing, all dissemblers, all liars. So the nurse's point of view on men is very negative, despite the fact that she was waxing lyrical about her husband and what a jolly old chap he was. She knows, with her age, she knows the world of men, she knows what they're like, she knows what they do, well, this is what she's saying, and her judgment is very fierce, really. And this is her advice to Juliet. And does Juliet take her advice? No, she doesn't. And does Juliet end up dead? Yes, she does. So again, Shakespeare shows us the older character, like Friar Lawrence, giving the advice that is ignored. Capulet's grief, about the death of Juliet is a key moment that could come up in a question, I think. It's the sort of thing that we usually think of the scene where he's screaming and shouting at her and telling her to get out of his house, but actually when she's dead, he says that death lies on her like an early frost on the first flower of spring or something like that. Like, he's lamenting the fact that she's died young and that she was the purest thing he had. And he told Paris at the beginning that the earth hath swallowed all my hopes but she. So he's had children, he's had lots of other children who've died and the earth has swallowed them, they're buried and dead, but she's the last one, and now when she's dead, he regrets it all. So if you get a question about parenthood, worth considering that moment. Romeo's resistance and the dramatic irony of I defy you, stars, I've already touched on. And then finally the suicide. And I've said there's a reversal of the role of tragic hero, and I think that's true for two reasons. Firstly, Romeo, actually, do you know what, I'm going to go back on that. It's not a reversal of the role of tragic hero, because Romeo is the archetypal tragic hero. He's the character who's named in the title, but so is Juliet, and he has the hamartia, the fatal flaw, and he follows it through to his own death. So that's absolutely standard. However, what I mean by Juliet being subversive is she then becomes a hero, because what she does upon learning of his death is take the far more painful option of stabbing herself with his dagger, and doesn't even hesitate. The moment she hears somebody coming, she says, "Oh, happy dagger, this is thy sheath, there rest and let me die," and just does it there and then, and dies over his body. Like, that is a hero's death, isn't it? To sort of slay oneself for love in the Renaissance kind of tradition of epic love stories. That's a kind of classic trope, to die for love, and that's what she does. But Romeo, of course, uses the poison, which in Shakespeare's day was known as the woman's weapon. It wasn't considered a particularly heroic or manly way to die, to drink poison, and that's what he does. So there's a bit of sort of reversal at the end, and a suggestion that perhaps, though she's a female character who usually in plays of that period played kind of second fiddle, so to speak, she actually, her name's there in the title, isn't it? She is a tragic hero as well. She's just bucking the trend by being a woman. Her hamartia then, if we were to posit that, if we were to make that almost a thesis statement, Juliet is a tragic hero, what's her hamartia, what's her fatal flaw? And that's kind of for you to decide, I think. Okay, let's take like a 2-minute break and then we'll do